Hello everyone, my name is Roby Velez, and in this video I'm going to give a short overview of genetic algorithms. Genetic algorithms are search algorithms that incorporate elements of Darwinian evolution. Search is a major subfield of computer science and includes examples like searching for something in Google search or finding a file or piece of data on your computer. And so search requires traversing some large amount of data, so a bunch of websites or all the files on your computer. Search can also be used to find solutions to a problem. So the example I like to give is NASA wanted to design an antenna for one of the spacecraft and use a genetic algorithm to evolve the shape of this antenna. One of the advantages of search is that it can, to find solutions like this, is that it can find solutions that humans wouldn't think of because it has the ability to try very unique and kind of combinations that we wouldn't think of. So let me give you an example of a task that we use to solve with genetic algorithm. So here I have a maze navigation task. So the goal is to get the robot that's in the center to move to the green circle within 6 moves. So one possible solution is the following list of movements: down, down, right, right, up. And that'll get the robot to move to that location. Now this solution doesn't work. It doesn't get the robot to the goal location. So how do we find a solution that gets the robot to the goal location? Well, one option is just to search through all the possible combinations of move sets, so we can just brute force the problem. Now, for this problem, that's 4 to the 6 possible combinations, which is a big number, but it's not too big. But this is also a relatively simple problem. And so as we get into more complicated and larger problems, this type of brute force method is not going to work. So the another alternative is simply to evolve a solution with a genetic algorithm. So let me give you an overview of how a genetic algorithm works. So within a genetic algorithm, we start off with some initial population. So here, these different robots represent different initial genomes that are all randomly generated and are different from one another. We're then going to take those genomes and evaluate them on some task. So in this case, we're going to run those genomes in the maze, and then we're going to look at the final distance of the robot and compute some fitness based on that distance. So smaller distance means higher fitness. So we're then going to label all of the individuals in our current population with their fitness score. So in this case, bigger numbers are better. We're then going to perform some type of selection where we'll select some top percentage of the best solutions in the population. We're going to take those individuals and implement crossover and mutation. So let me talk about crossover and mutation. In crossover, we'll take 2 candidate solutions and we'll take both of their genomes and combine them together to produce a new solution. So an example I showed you here, we're going to take the first 2 genes of the individual on the left and then the last 4 genes of the individual on the right and use that to produce a new solution, the one on the bottom. We're going to do this over and over again until we generate, so then once we have that new child, we can then do mutation. So with mutation, in this example, we're going to pick one of the genes at random, and we're just going to randomly change it. So the second gene, we're going to change it from a down movement to a right movement. Now, once we've done crossover mutation, we're going to add this individual into a new population, and we're going to keep doing that process over and over again, crossover mutation, until we generate a new population that's the same size as the old population. That's one way of doing it. With this new population, we're going to evaluate that new population and update all of their fitness scores. We're then going to do selection again. We're going to do crossover mutation again, generate a new population, and we're going to repeat this generation loop over and over again until either we solve our problem. So we check for termination once we've applied the fitness. We check our solution. We check our solution and see, do any of them actually solve our problem? Do any of them get to the goal location? Or we do this until we reach some max generation. For most generic algorithms, for most really difficult problems, we aren't going to find a solution that perfectly solves our problem. Eventually we'll just run out of computation time and we'll just grab the best one. So this is a very high-level overview of a generic algorithm. But sometimes it's better to actually look at code to see how these different operations are actually implemented. So here is some sample code that I wrote that implements the genetic algorithm. This is just a main class. A link to this code can be found below. So let's talk about some of these major functions one at a time, and in the process talk about different elements of genetic algorithms. So the first major function I'm going to talk about is creating the population. So here's a code snippet for creating the population. Now the main thing I want to talk about is creating the encoding. So the encoding for the problem. So creating the encoding is one of the most difficult parts of implementing a GA. So in this example, our coding is simply a list of numbers from 0 to 3. So what we did is we have a task where we have a robot that has to traverse this maze, and the solution is just a list of movement commands. And so the way we can encode that within a computer program is simply turn those list of movements into numbers. So up is a 3, right is a 0, down is a 1. And so that's a way of taking this physical type task and converting it into an encoding that we could then apply a search algorithm to it. So yes, so in this case, our encoding is just a list of directions that we can then turn into lists of integers. Problems can possess many different types of value encodings that can affect how easy they are to solve and how easy they are to do other operations like crossover and mutation. So let me present some other example problems, and we can talk about the potential encodings. Again, because figuring out the encoding for a GA is a very important part of implementing a GA. So one potential problem is a traveling salesman problem. So in traveling salesman problem, you have to visit every city within a graph like this. So you must visit each node only once. You must start and end at the same node. These paths are bidirectional, and the goal is to minimize the path costs. So one way to get a genetic algorithm to solve this task is to encode it the same way we did the maze task, where we just have a list of cities that we visit, and so we're just evolving the ordering of that list. And same thing we did for the directions, the city labels can just be turned into numbers. So an example genome could be BCAD. So that's the order that this particular solution traversed in this graph. Now, one thing you might notice is that we're violating one of our rules, that we must start and end at the same node. So our genome doesn't incorporate that idea that we must start and end at the same node. I'll talk about that in the next slide. Another potential problem we could try to solve is evolve the dimensions of a stable table, so something that doesn't fall over, in a 3D physics simulator. So this is the simulation of a physical object, so how do we turn that into a genome that we can then operate with a genetic algorithm? Well, one way of encoding it is to simply create a genome that has different dimensions of the label itself, the table itself. So in this case, we have a genome that's 6 values, that contains 6 values, the width and the length of the tabletop, and then a dimension for leg 1, leg 2, leg 3, leg 4. Now I mentioned before that problems can have different types of encodings. So this is one way of encoding this particular problem. We can also encode it this way, where we just have a genome with 3 values, where we have the width and the length of the tabletop, and then we encode all the legs together. It's just a single value that we copy and paste to all the different legs. And we'll talk about this again later when we talk about mutation. So very quickly, I want to talk about the idea of genotype versus phenotype. So in biology, a genome would be your DNA, and your phenotype would be your resulting animal, your resulting creature. For the example, for the task for evolving a table dimension, a genome would be that series of dimensions, that series of numbers, and the phenotype would be the physical table. So one way of differentiating the genotype from phenotype is a genotype is what gets operated on by the search. It's what gets permutated. Whereas a phenotype, it's what gets evaluated. It's what gets put into our fitness function that gets crunched on and gives us back our fitness or non-fitness. Now for the traveling salesman problem, our genome is the order of cities that we're going to encounter. But again, because of the way the problem's set up, we have to make sure that we visit the first city again And so our genome is just the 4 cities and their ordering, and in our phenotype, we just tack on the first city again. Now, it's possible that you don't even have to do this, that when you create your genome, you just randomly create the 4 cities, but you're going to wind up having a lot of genomes that are invalid because you have to hit that first city at the beginning and at the end. So this is a little bit of a constrained example, but it's an example that you can have a genotype that you operate on and that you use to search a space, and then you can then change that into a phenotype that you then apply your fitness to. And that can help make the problem a little bit easier. So we talked about creating initial population. So that was the first part, creating initial population and doing different encodings. Now let's move on to talk about evaluation. So the evaluation function, generally the evaluation function in most generic algorithms is going to be the most computationally expensive or complicated part of the GAs. So these evaluation functions are going to be physics simulators if you're evolving, say, a spider robot. They're going to be maybe big graphs if you're doing something like an NP problem or traveling salesman problem. So just know that the evaluation function is usually the most complicated, the most expensive parts. So in this example here, for this problem, the piece of code below just executes the mode that the moves that we're evolving for this robot problem and finds some final position, and then we compute the distance to the goal. And so in this instance, smaller numbers mean higher fitness. And so if you have a function that is supposed to maximize values, one way that you can search for small numbers is just multiply your fitness by -1. And so if you multiply by -1, then all small numbers are effectively, you can maximize those smaller numbers. Now, this fitness function is a single objective, just single objective, but you can have fitness functions that are multi-objective, where your fitness values are just a sum weighted of different objectives, or you can use a Pareto front to grab solutions that balance a bunch of different objectives equally. So for the maze navigation task, another objective could be not hitting a wall. So every time you hit a wall, that actually lowers your fitness. For the table task, it could be some type of stability, but also could be resources. So you want a table that's stable, but also a table that's not too big, because maybe you have a limited amount of lumber. And so you can put that into your evolution algorithm and try to find a candidate that satisfies multiple objectives. Okay, so that was evaluation function, just very quickly. There's not much I can talk about it in this. Again, it depends on the problem. So now let's go over to selection. How do you select the best individuals from your population that you'll then do crossover and mutation on? So selection is generally a balance between picking the best solutions, but also preserving diversity. So in the code snippet above, what we're doing is we're randomly selecting an individual from some top percent of the population. So if the cutoff percent in the piece of code above is low, like 10%, we only grab the 10% of the best individuals. If the cutoff is high, we're going to preserve diversity. So why do we want to preserve diversity within these selection processes? Well, mainly because we want to avoid local optima. And so I'll talk about that in the next slide. So this is a very kind of simple way of doing selection, just select the top percent of a population. Another way of doing it is with some type of proportional select or roulette wheel selection. So in proportional selection, the probability to select an individual is based on their fitness or rank, if you're doing rank selection, compared to the entire population. So individual 3 here has a fitness of 0.6, and compared to the rest of the population, the rest of these other 4 individuals, that means when they have a almost 50% chance of getting selected. So the potential downside to something like a proportional selection compared to a rank selection is that if there is a great difference in fitness values, you can get a situation where you're most likely going to pick individual 3 when you're doing selection. And if individual 3 is in the local optima, then you're going to get stuck in local optima. And you're going to ignore things like individual 4 and 5, which may have elements of them that are useful to get to the global optima. So another way of doing selection, say for a multi-objective, is with a Pareto front, where you have multiple objectives across multiple dimensions, and so you just pick the solutions that are at the front of those different dimensions. But that's one way of doing, say, multi-objective selection. So let me talk about local optima. So if you downloaded the maze code and run it a couple times, you might have noticed that sometimes it doesn't actually find a solution. It doesn't actually converge. Many times the code will end and say that the highest fitness it found was a fitness of -2. The reason is because the problem, this maze task that I've given you actually has a local optima. So the numbers I've laid in represent the fitness at specific locations. And so what's going on is that moving towards the goal actually initially results in lower fitness. So if the robot walks up 2 steps to the position that's shown on screen now, it actually has a lower fitness than when it started. And so what's going to happen is the evolution algorithm is going to be reluctant to move to that position because it's going to be penalized for it. And so that is a local, and so the starting location is a local optima. So local optimas are areas within a search, high areas of fitness within a search space surrounded by low fitness. So here is kind of another example. So we have this robot, so a two-dimensional example is we have this robot that wants to climb these hills, where height is fitness. So as the robot tries to climb the hill, it goes over the local optima, and as it starts heading towards the global optima, it's going to stop because it's getting low fitness. It's getting towards that valley. Instead, it's going to turn around and head back towards the local optima. And so now it's stuck here. It's unwilling to try to traverse that valley because it's going to get low fitness, and so it's going to sit there forever. And so one way of avoiding this is with diversity. So if the other members of that population were, say, these individuals over here, by selecting for these other individuals, these starting locations are more favorable to finding the global optima. And so increasing, especially this individual here that I'm pointing to. So population diversity means we have a better chance of covering the entire search area and finding that global optima and avoiding these local optimas. So that was selection. And so now really quickly, let's finish and talk about crossover and mutation. So in crossover, we're going to pick a crossover point and split the parent genomes at that point, and then we're going to use that to create a new child. So here is an example of single point crossover, so the example I've been using. But you can also have something called multi-point crossover, where you pick multiple points within the parent genomes and you cut and slice them up to make your child. Now, one very important part of crossover is that you need like genes to line up together. So in real evolution, you want the genes for eye color line up with the genes for eye color. You wouldn't exchange the gene for eye color, say, with the genes for leg length. So looking at the example of table dimensions, when we do crossover with these two different genomes, we're going to exchange the genes for leg lengths together and not mix them up with the genes for the table. Now, because of this restriction, crossover doesn't always make sense in a lot of problems, especially if you have problems where your genome grows. It can be very hard to line up the genome so that the genes make sense with one another. And so especially when you're, say, evolving artificial neural networks. And so because of this, sometimes crossover is not always implemented and you just use mutation. So in mutation, so for the example for this task, in this code snippet, what we're doing is we're going to the genome and we're just flipping a coin for each gene. And if that gene is selected, we just randomly change that gene. So mutation, there are many different ways of implementing mutation. Other options that I could have chosen for this example is that I can only change a gene to an adjacent gene. So for instance, if the original gene is 0, I can only change it to a 1 or a 3. If the original gene is 2, I can only change it to a 1 or a 3, for example. Similarly, I could just flip a coin for a particular genome and determine whether I should mutate that genome at all. So there could be some instances where I don't even perform mutation on a genome at all. Now, mutation operators will also change based on the task encoding. So one question I have for you as we come towards the end of this video is, how would you implement mutation for the list of cities of the traveling salesman problem? Or how do the mutations affect the two ways I presented of encoding the table dimensions? Is one genome better than another genome when you're doing mutation? So that's my overview of genetic algorithms. I haven't covered everything that encompasses genetic algorithms, but I've touched on a few kind of key points that most people will encounter when you're trying to implement these or just trying to understand them. Thank you all for listening, and if you have any questions, please leave them down below. Thank you.